London's intellectual elite were gathered to hear the philosopher Carlyle speak about the prophet. They had anticipated the usual invective, and they were astonished to watch him holding up the prophet as a heroic, adventurous figure whose sacrifices had brought a natural theism to his people and had much to teach a materialistic Victorian England. The climax came when the lecturer cried, "Benthamy utility, virtue by profit and loss, reducing this God's world to a dead brute steam engine. If you ask me which gives, Mahomet or they, the beggarlier and falser view of man and his destinies in the universe, I will answer, it is not Mahomet." Stung to the quick, John Stuart Mill leapt to his feet and cried out, "No." The secular economist Mill has, of course, not been alone in his response. Until recently, no was, by and large, the response of the West. For medievals, the prophet was a simulacrum, his followers his dupes. That judgment on his sincerity is no longer defended, but even today, in a world that is increasingly shaped by Mill's atheistic and social Darwinist view of the world, appeals against his verdict are not always sympathetically heard. Some of you might have read Oliver Moody's piece in The Times this morning. Whatever that arch-Victorian Mill would have wished, religion in Britain is increasingly, as he puts it, black and brown. Along with the growth of African churches, Islam is about the only prospering segment of religion in Britain's rapidly secularizing society. 10% of babies here now are Muslim. Pessimists in our community should be reassured by this proof that there is at least one thing that we Muslims know how to do. And a very remarkable 88% of Muslim adults claim to harbour a strong or very strong belief in God. What would Mill have made of that? Well, even in Muslim minority settings, like here, where the new generation was exposed to modern secular culture from an early age, the signs are Muslim observance is resilient. The Cardiff University research study on religious nurture in British Muslim families, completed in February 2012, showed that Muslims are generally successful in transferring their convictions and rituals to the new generation. The study showed that 77% of adult Muslims actively practiced the faith they were brought up in, compared with 29% of Christians and 65% of other religions. Converts, too, have continued to join the British Muslim community in significant numbers, with an estimated total of 60,000 new Muslims in 2001, rising to some 100,000 only 10 years later. Again, contrary to popular perceptions, 67% of these neo-Muslims were female. Overall, educated white women are the most likely Britons to embrace Islam. Again, very surprising and unpredicted to social Darwinists of the type of Mill, but this is our reality. Although a small number are attracted to radicalism, it's generally the case that Muslims, including these new Muslims, see their adherence to Islam as a sensible decision, rooted in perceptions of an Islamic reasonableness. Other recent surveys also seem to bear out this perception. The 2007 Gallup poll highlighted what two scholars describe as Islam's silenced majority, the chronically faithful Muslims who are alienated by Islamist radicalism but are seldom heard by outsiders. The statistics demonstrate that followers of the Prophet are on average more likely than the American public to unequivocally condemn attacks on civilians. 3 times as many Americans believe that attacks on civilians are completely justified when compared to Iranians. And in the United Kingdom, in a 2009 Gallup survey, Muslims scored remarkably highly on standard tests. 77% of followers of the Prophet identified very strongly with the UK, compared to just 51% of the general population. 76% of Muslims were confident in the police, contrasted with a national average of 65%. On these and a range of other citizenship indicators, Muslims, a community noted for these very high rates of religious observance, score very highly when compared to the current British norm, despite feeling misunderstood. A recent article in The Economist entitled itself, "British Muslims are pious, loyal and unhappy." That was the title of The Economist piece, summing up the followers of the Prophet in this country: pious, loyal and unhappy. It's probably quite accurate. All the signs are that despite some popular misconceptions, mainstream affiliation to the Prophet's religion seems to add significant value to citizenship and social cohesion, just as much as radical Islam supplies its polar opposite. Despite the lunatic fringe, Islam is certainly the great religious success story of our country. The current strong religious trends probably allow us to expect that in a few decades, the Prophet of Islam will be the most significant and significantly followed religious founder in the United Kingdom. It seems his destiny to be these islands' future sage, patriarch, and co-celebrant of God's power and mystery. As demonstrations, let it be recalled, they were all peaceful, over the weekend have shown, Muslims are unusual in a further way, confounding the assurance of many that religion must liberalise to survive, certainly Mill's perspective. The manifest popularity of Islamic belief here seems to be a function of a noteworthy conservatism in doctrine, liturgy, and social practice. And in this, we detect again the ongoing guiding hand of the Prophet. For the demonstrators in Whitehall, the present tense is key. Who is Muhammad? Title of this lecture indicates that to insult the Prophet is not to slander some ancient archival figure of the dim historical past, but to libel someone living. Living, however, in what exact sense? Muslims famously disagree here. For the great commentaries on the hadith collections, one may still direct prayers through him to God. This belief fills the poetic anthology of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, greatest of the commentators on Bukhari. So just to take one example, this Imam of the people of hadith writes this: بباب جودك عبد مذنب كلف يا أحسن الناس وجها مشرقا وقفا بكم توسل يرجو العفو عن زلل من خوفه جفنه الهامي لقد ذرفا. By the gate of your generosity stands a sinner mad with love, O best of mankind, in shining face and countenance. Through you he seeks a means, hoping for Allah's forgiveness of slips. From fear of him, his eyelid is wet with pouring tears. Well, certainly alive there, certainly in the present tense. Is this particular doctrine, popular particularly among the hadith scholars, but not really essential, what the title of this lecture is going to mean? Or are we instead referring to the apparent sense of the hadith that indicates that believers may see the Holy Prophet in dreams? Not necessarily. Those demonstrators over the weekend were showing something no less significant. Indeed, for practical purposes, something a good deal more significant. The Holy Prophet is alive in their hearts, their actions, their vision of the beauty and meaning of the cosmos. This future religious patriarch of the United Kingdom is active, influential, a living leader in the true sense. Let's shift the optics slightly before considering in more detail what exactly this might mean. The news, of course, are filled with reports of aberrations, but aberrations in Muslim history come and go. We no longer recall the Almohads, the Khurramiyya, the Qadizadalis, the Jalalis. It's not overly surprising that the power of the prophetic principle impacting against the jealous gods of modernity is not always wisely or compassionately received by all human hearts. There are some in our time who look at the prophetic legacy and the heritage of the Salaf in all its dazzling and difficult diversity, in all its millions of texts, and conclude that we must reach for whatever seems most fierce and narrow in our interpretations of that man. For that seems most likely to avoid compromise and to be authentic. This, of course, is just a malfunction in our usul, our jurisprudence. Narrowness is never a virtue or a principle in itself. Indeed, overwhelmingly, the prophetic legacy rejects the religion's. The prophetic legacy insists on giving populations ease and help, not difficulty. Those who reject the religion scholars and impose the narrowest possible view on ordinary Muslims are in danger of creating a riddastan, a place where religion is experienced so harshly that more and more people will find it impossible to believe. Just last month, I spoke to a Saudi scholar who works with former fighters in Iraq and Syria, and he surprised me by claiming that many of them return as atheists. That's what he said. So a classical pattern is reasserting itself. The extreme brutality and selfishness of the Anglo-Saxon invasion has produced this reflex, and eventually some sort of positive reaction and return to the classical positions of interpreting the prophetic norm is to be hoped for. So let's then set those principles aside, those tendencies, the lunatic fringe. Let the journalists and the ulama, the scholars, assess and analyse them. But behind the headlines, as we can see from the statistics about the growth of Islam, even here, there flow much more significant tides. We needn't condone all aspects of them, but they need mentioning, simply to indicate how broad is the spectrum of the Muslim world's response to the intriguing question of exactly how one interprets the legacy of the one who is alive in our hearts in a contemporary setting. Let's take a couple of examples almost at random. Firstly, I'd like to speak about Abdurrahman Wahid, died in 2009, a man who personally had a very strong personal devotion to the Holy Prophet. He was the Indonesian equivalent of what we might call a Brailvi. He studied first in conservative madrasas in his native Java and then enrolled at Al-Azhar University in Cairo. On his return, he worked as a journalist before becoming Dean of the Sharia and Doctrine faculty of a major Indonesian university, after which he was elected chairman of Indonesia's largest Islamic organization. In fact, because of the demography, it's the world's largest Islamic organization, Nahdlatul Ulama. But you can read the Times from cover to cover every day for a year, never heard of it. Why? Because they don't support extremism. But it's the world's largest Islamic organization, and he got to run it. In this role, in the 80s and 90s, he campaigned against the Western-backed dictatorship of General Suharto, thus joining the ranks of Muslim scholars around the world who in those years were agitating for representative government, risking persecution at the hands of pro-Western secularists. Through his many sermons and theological writings, Wahid gained immense popularity in the mosques as a democracy and human rights advocate, inspired by a traditional Sunni theology and his distinctive reading of the prophetic biography. And this ensured his election in 1999 as Indonesia's first democratic president. As often in the Islamic world, religiously driven democratic activism had been locked in a struggle against an American-backed dictatorship with an appalling human rights record. However, on coming to power, Wahid found inspiration in the Prophet's reconquest of Mecca by refusing to take revenge on former opponents. Instead, he sought to build positive relationships with the old elites and with the Western and other secular powers which had persecuted him and his movement before its final vindication at the polls. His lifelong struggle with the country's secular military establishment continued even after his retirement, when he accused elements in the army of covert involvement in the 2005 Bali bombings. Wahid advocated a positive relationship between religions, freedom of expression and belief, and a democratic political order, all of which had been suppressed under the former military junta. Let's take another, rather different case of a contemporary figure whose life has been inspired by reading of the prophetic example. This is Pakistan's Mother Teresa, the devout living saint Abdus Sattar Edi. Born in 1928, his childhood was blighted by his mother's paralysis, mental illness, and early death. As a refugee in Karachi, following partition, he worked as a street peddler. But the destitute Edi offered his life to God through the service of the country's most needy people. Through begging, he bought a second-hand van which he turned into an impromptu ambulance. Today, his Edi Foundation is Pakistan's largest charity, running the world's largest voluntary ambulance service and maintaining a network of over 300 clinics, rehabilitation centres, orphanages, homes for the mentally ill, and centres for sick animals. Edi himself, in the Sufi tradition, draws no salary, takes no holidays, lives in a tiny apartment, and following the Prophet's example, owns only one change of clothes. His organisation is now international and has contributed to a range of international relief efforts around the world, including the, for instance, 2005 New Orleans hurricane. These individuals are regarded as heroes in the Muslim world and are celebrated precisely for walking in the footsteps of the Holy Prophet and the companions. The first, theologian president of the most populous Muslim country, while the second is a champion of the sick and the marginalised. For most believing Muslims, it's people like these who incarnate the reality of the Prophet's legacy. Where secular regimes and civil institutions have failed, the sacrifices of such role models is giving hope to millions. And their example goes some way, I think, to explaining the ongoing popularity and growth of Islam around the world. These individuals were risk-takers and mould breakers. We should admit that, as in the stories of Moses tapping the Red Sea with his staff, Jesus choosing the road to Jerusalem, the Buddha renouncing his kingdom, or Muhammad accepting persecution by his own people, they make sacrifices that seem odd by contemporary criteria. There's something about religious discipleship or prophetic following in our age that makes one necessarily strange, countercultural, eccentric. The Catholic theologian Hans Kumm calls the founder of Islam discontinuity in person. Let's now turn to a few specific dimensions of his chosen lifestyle, not only to get a better sense of his vision for his society, but to try and breathe the atmosphere of the very distinctive ethos he was proposing, the essence of what we might describe as the Islamic, the perfume that he conjured forth in Arabia, the essence, the inward meaning of the outward events of his career. So the first of the two big principles that I want to talk about, one could speak about facets of the prophetic biography indefinitely, but there's two I specifically want to rehearse this evening. The first is the principle of apostolic poverty. Now, here at the religion's heart, the figure of the prophet, his chosen style of life, we find a very consistent and challenging example of a man who not only preached against the miseries of poverty and took political sides, endangering himself with the poor, but joined them in his own manner of life. We might say that for him there could be no preferential option for the poor without a preferential option for poverty. His virtue, if you read the traditional hagiographies, is what the vocabulary of the religion calls zuhud, which is usually rendered into English as asceticism. We might cautiously accept that translation with two important provisos. Firstly, Islam cannot connect celibacy with renunciation, because as An-Nawawi, one of the great medieval theologians, says, all the desires harden the heart with the exception of sexual desire, which softens it. Secondly, his was not an asceticism of method, a via purgativa, since his proximity to God was already accomplished, or rather had been given as part of the prophetic charism, those a given prophecy who were already humanly perfect. So his renunciation was not of things that his self passionately craved, but appeared as the natural form of life as someone who was in love with God. As Jalaluddin Rumi puts it, that poverty is not for the sake of avoiding entanglements. No, it is because nothing fully exists but God. In a representative piece of modern devotional writing, the 20th century scholar of Makkah, Shaykh Muhammad Alawi al-Maliki, describes him as the perfect Zahid, the flawless exemplar of holy poverty. Maliki's treatment takes its cue from a celebrated hadith found in the classical collections of Bukhari and Muslim, which describes how the Prophet once rose from a rush mat on which he'd been sleeping, with marks visible on his shoulder. The companions asked whether in future they might spread something less hard for him to sleep on, but he replied, "What have I to do with this world? Towards this world, my likeness is that of a wayfarer travelling on a summer day who rests in the afternoon beneath a tree and then moves on, leaving it behind." And then Maliki lists a whole raft of scriptural proof texts which tell believers how months would pass without a cooking pot without a cooking fire being lit in his house. He ate only barley bread, never bread from wheat flour. He had only one set of clothes and sandals. When engaged in hard physical labour, he would tie a flat stone to his stomach to reduce the pangs of hunger. He would never eat more than one kind of food at a private meal in his house. If it were dates, he would not touch bread. God offered to turn the mountains of Mecca into gold for him, but he prayed, "No, O Lord, but I shall hunger for a day and be satisfied the next, so that when I am satisfied I shall praise and thank you, and when I hunger I shall humble myself to you and pray." Now, the most popular genre of Muslim creative literature is the panegyric poem, the summit of the Muslim belletrist ambition is always to write a great poem about the virtues of the Prophet. And the best known of all of these is called the Burda, the Mantle Ode, of al-Busiri, who was Egyptian in the 13th century. And this shows how important this principle of holy poverty is to the Muslim imagination of who he was. The rhetorical progression of this rather long poem begins with an evocation of nostalgia for the lost homeland, followed by an explanation of how that homeland has been lost through the pursuit of vain passion, and then proposes the Prophet as the sure guide through the desert. In our perplexity and self-intoxication, only a renunciation as radical as his will awaken us to the miraculous nature of prophecy and sainthood, which alone can put an end to our exile from our true home. So Busiri writes, recreating his own moment of repentance. ظلمت سنة من أحيا الظلام إلى أن اشتكت قدماه الضر من ورم. I've wronged the way of he who brought life to the dark night, to the point that his feet would swell painfully due to his night prayers. وشد من سغب أحشاءه وطوى تحت الحجارة كشفا مترف الأدم. He tied a length of cloth over his stomach from hunger, his waist emaciated beneath a stone. This image of the Prophet's poverty was recurrent and irreproachably sourced, yet it gave rise to a number of arguments. The first concerned the reason for his anger over the poverty of others. The Quran itself, after all, urges the feeding of the poor and denounces those who are indifferent to their misery. It decrees the feeding of 10 paupers, for example, as the expiation for a violated oath. That's in Surah 5, verse 89. A share of the sacrificial meat at the Hajj pilgrimage is to be given to the poor. Zakat monies, the Muslim tithe, are to be primarily used for the relief of poverty. So it seems that the religion's basic structures and commandments massively internalise the virtue of charitable giving for the alleviation of hunger and poverty, which are seen as primary social evils. Yet the Prophet himself was poor, and moreover had chosen poverty since his position of political authority in Medina offered him access, had he so wished, to considerable treasure. His was, as Maliki repeats, faqr ikhtiyar, not faqr idtirar, voluntary, not involuntary poverty. So we get the next line in Busiri's poem running as follows. وراودته الجبال الشم من ذهب عن نفسه فأراها أيما شمم. The lofty mountains become gold, sought to tempt him away from his soul, but he showed them such disdain. This was manifestly in lived solidarity with the poor of his city. The biographers report that he would not sleep at night until any food and coins that might remain in his house had been given to the poor. It was also, as Rumi sees it, because the true lover may become detached from all save the beloved, even though in his case he was in the very middle of the world by virtue of his prophetic office. This is what's known as khalwat dar anjuman, solitude in the multitude, which includes a personal detachment from deprivation, whose presence in others might arouse the prophetic wrath. If the Prophet opposed poverty in his world, yet cultivated it in his own life, in what sense is it part of the Muslim imitatio, the Muslim desire to emulate the Prophet? Should it be classed with the category, interesting category, of prophetic practices known as khasa'is, that is to say, duties applicable to him alone, from which his community is exempt? Not everything the Prophet did is regarded as a binding precedent. The tahajjud prayer, for instance, was an obligation for him, and he spent hours in prayer every night. But for his followers, for ordinary Muslims, it's just a recommended practice, a sunnah. The wisal fast, in which he refrained from eating at sundown but continued fasting through the night, was permissible to him, but is unlawful to his community, simply too onerous. And this genre of private devotions has always intrigued the commentators, given the religion's general strong emphasis on prophetic emulation. And there have been, down the centuries, a number of lengthy discussions about this. But whether or not they took the intensity of the Prophet's lifestyle and devotion to be a binding precedent, most Muslim scholars were sure about the general preferability of poverty over wealth. Al-Ghazali, perhaps the greatest of all classical Muslim theologians, in his discussion of the subject, takes this to be the clear sense of the Prophet's statement, narrated by Tirmidhi, that the poor of my community shall enter paradise 500 years before the rich. And of another hadith which runs, shall I not tell you who shall be the kings of paradise? Every weak oppressed one, marked by dust and unkempt hair, noticed by no one. Yet Ghazali also warns us against the dangers of a false adherence to poverty, a lethal danger in some Sufi circles where the patched robe had become a temptation to ostentation and vainglory. The sincere wealthy are far better than the greedy poor. Zuhud, he concludes, is to renounce the world from conviction as to its insignificance when compared to the preciousness of the next world. As for a Muslim who renounces its temptations for any other reason, he is no kind of zahid. And extremism in this, as in everything else, he concludes, is unacceptable to God. And this Ghazalian perspective is actually the mainstream one in Islamic piety. The word faqr, poverty, is linked to an ancient Arabian word for back, because poverty is the breaking of one's back. If this condition is chosen as part of a process of spiritual purgation, or from simple love of God, it lies at the heart of religion. If it's forced on others who cannot bear it, it is a deadly crime. The Prophet also says, were poverty to be a man, I would slay him, and prays to God to preserve him from a poverty that causes forgetfulness or a wealth that causes tyranny. In other words, the poverty that breaks the back of the human spirit is of the devil, but the poverty that breaks the back of the ego is of God, and the sign of the latter's presence is the love of God. At this point, having indicated some of the tensions and debates within the Muslim tradition, I'd like to offer some thoughts on their application to our present world. And I'd like to attempt this by considering or reconsidering the figure of Abraham and the specifically Ishmaelite hue of the Ka'ba's religion. To understand the Prophet and the way in which Muslims see his role in the big story of salvation history, you have to remember that the Prophet's Abrahamic affiliation is specifically Ishmaelite. That is to say, unlike the Hebrew patriarchs, who are the descendants of Abraham's younger son, Isaac, through Sarah, the Prophet Muhammad, and hence, spiritually speaking, his descendants, the Muslims, are the heirs and descendants of the elder son, Ishmael. And there is something specifically Ishmaelite, and also Hajar being Ishmael's mother, about the spiritual quality of Islam, which is important to grasp. Now, oddly, given the fact, possibly an arguable fact, that the Jesus of the Gospels is a somewhat less ascetic figure than the Muhammad of the Hadiths, Islamic cultures always love to associate zuhud, this asceticism, renunciation, with Jesus. Yet the endlessly fertile Genesis story of Abraham has had different repercussions for the way Muslims and Christians have seen and received the world, both as history and as creation of God. Abraham is, of course, anti-idolatrous in both cases, in both traditions, and for the rabbis, is a breaker of the idols in the soul, the attachments which prevent us from surrendering to God. Yet in Islam, he possesses this additional Meccan dimension. In a well-known meditation on Abraham, the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas contrasts the patriarch with Ulysses. Abraham has migrated from homeland into an alterity which is thereby affirmed. Ulysses, the European, and hence, on Levinas's view, the Pauline Christian, leaves alterity and returns to his home. Unlike Abraham, home is his destiny. In Europe, there is resolution, the closing of a circuit which brings redemption. The new Israel becomes a bounded homeland, an eschatological space. Alterity lies outside the city and is fallen, while the homeland, which for Levinas signifies ontology, is regained and considered universal. Here, Levinas thinks, is the core distinction between Jewish and Christian readings of Abraham, the knight of faith. As he writes, it is in the impurity of the world, which the Old Testament takes on together with all its facts, that purity is made. But it is made, it is an act. There is no redemption of the world, only a transformation of the world. Self-redemption is already an action. Purely inner repentance is a contradiction in terms. Suffering has no magical effect. The just man who suffers is worthy not because of his suffering, but because of his justice, which defies suffering. It's not simply that the great self-renunciation prefigured by Abraham, which launches Christianity, has not in practice, as Levinas sees it, recognizably redeemed the world. It is that redemption itself is un-Abrahamic, being implicitly predicated on a polarity of self and other. What is required is justice. And he adds, polemically, it is in economic justice that man glimpses the face of man. Has Christianity itself found a horizon for its generosity other than in famine and drought? Levinas's project, a very post-Holocaust project, then casts Judaism as the opponent of any scheme to redeem the world, something which he thinks will be grounded in an inexorably dichotomizing logic. Instead, one is to strive for justice, and for economic justice in particular, while acknowledging the Hebrew Bible's sense of the non-perfectibility of the world. Now, that kind of rather polemical dichotomizing between the intentions of the Christian and the Jewish Abrahams is certainly arguable, And it's hard to resist pointing out the irony of a philosophy that decries any resolution in one's apprehension of the other, essentially postmodern, while offering so substantial a polemic against what it takes to be the intrinsic nature of another faith. Perhaps his abrasiveness here is no more than part of his necessarily bitter reaction to Simone Weil. He has not adequately seen that attitudes diverge within Christianity, partly due to the ambiguity of the Church's situation between Pentecost and Perusia. Is Christianity to be fully collected, a realized eschatology in which there is justice and plenty, validly, or is it to be a new Israel in the sense that it must renounce and sacrifice for the true society which only the second coming can inaugurate? These are internal Christian questions. But we should let that be and instead consider where Islam's Abraham might place us within this imagined polarity. We note that Islam's Abraham, the Prophet's ancestor, that great archetype of renunciation of home and family, does not simply migrate into alterity, as Levinas proposes, but returns home, not to Chaldea, of course, but to the great sanctuary, the ancient place of worship established by Adam, the city of Mecca. Unlike Ulysses, he revisits an unsuspected home, discovering that Ithaca was an illusion, and his yearning for it a false or metaphorical nostalgia. His renunciation of homeland, self, does not compel an eternal irresolution. Hence he is not Islam's Abraham, and hence the prophetic spirit is not the Levinasian Abraham, champion of aporia and leader of the merciless war, as Levinas says, the merciless war declared by the Bible and the Talmud on the sacred and sacraments. Nor is he the Christian Abraham, whose readiness to sacrifice his son inaugurates a people that is the prototype of the church, which is to be a true city of justice within an unredeemed world. This Abraham is, as the Quran says, neither Christian nor Jew, but a primordial monotheist, a Muslim. This is Quran 2, verse 135. The great sanctuary, which he builds up and reconsecrates, is a reminder of the primordial cosmic covenant. His is a migration back to the place where all souls affirmed God. The temper of Islam, therefore, acknowledges the world's non-perfectibility and awaits, though mildly, the parousia, but by building itself on a reminder of humanity's original grace, seeks to transform the world with an Ishmaelite law, a law for the poor, in which relief of the unfortunate through the zakat and other institutions is legally enforced and is not left only to private charity. As the Meccan scripture commands, take alms of their wealth so that you may purify and sanctify them. The rejection of primogeniture and the prohibition of usury are nothing but accessories to this prophetic project of disaggregating wealth. There's a second departure from the Genesis story, which I feel also helps us to understand the specific atmosphere of the prophet's religion. The Bible speaks of Ishmael, but is concerned primarily with Isaac and his descendants. The scripture which appears in the Meccan sanctuary affirms Isaac's covenant, but is to be an Ishmaelite manifesto. Ishmael, recorded in the Quran as the builder of the Kaaba with his father, is buried in the Meccan temple beside his mother, the Gentile matriarch Hajar, and his daughters. It's in this sanctuary, with its overwhelmingly Ishmaelite ambience, that the prophet of poverty receives his first revelations, which include some of the Quran's most searching indictments of Meccan indifference to the poor, the weak, and the orphaned. What is it to belong to the nation of Ishmael, the Bani Ismail? Most obviously, his name indicates the virtue of hearing God and being heard by him. Ishmael is, at least for the later Muslim tradition, the son for whom a ram is substituted. But he is the site of a further sacrifice, one that has been neglected, but is perhaps still more intriguing and difficult. He is banished with his tragic mother due to the jealousy of Sarah, an act that was hardly less certain a sentence of death than the Aqidah itself. Again, Abraham is choosing poverty at God's command by divesting himself of his only irreplaceable assets, his two sons. This second sacrifice is one of the fertile enigmas of the book of Genesis. Hajar and Ishmael are guiltless, and yet they are punished by being driven out, by an exile. In this, they resemble their father more than Isaac does. Yet the authors of the text are quite clear about the subsequent salvation history, as Westermann's commentary on Genesis concludes. The expulsion of Ishmael limits the people which calls Abraham its father to the single line, the descendants of Isaac. The attempted sacrifice of Isaac, which is not prefigured in his father, opens a covenant. The attempted sacrifice of Ishmael, which does echo his father's own trial, creates the symbol of the dead end, the withered branch, the dry root. Traditionally, the language, the scriptural language with which the Christian imagination has seen Islam and its prophet. God is to be with the privileged, not with the outcast and the bereft. St. Paul drives this home in Galatians 4, verses 22 to 30, where he repeats, "Cast out the slave and her son, for the slave shall not inherit with the son of the free woman." And if you look at a lot of evangelical websites, as they seek to find a biblical paradigm for understanding Islam, this idea of the outcast, the Hajarine, rejected Ishmaelite, is usually one of the first texts they reach for. Now, of course, Paul is saying it in the first... No, I'm useless without my script, so somebody must find the switch. So this passage in Galatians, Paul is using it as part of his polemic against the Jews. But today it seems to have, in this new polemic coming from the American religious right, reverted to this original Ishmaelite subject. So much current American rhetoric, for instance, about freedom, as opposed to various forms of Islam, may quite credibly be traced back to this sort of biblical anomaly. The Muslims have their law, they have the Sharia, but America is honour bound to defend freedom, which is the slogan that you see as you go into Guantanamo, this idea of freedom in the law, Paul, and being bound by the law, freedom from the law, freedom in the law, is something that is very important in certain evangelical Christian constructions about the war on terror. Of course, Paul had no such intention. But the idea is widespread that Ishmael is in bondage to his law, while the American is free in the spirit. For the ideologues of an American apotheosis of history, Ishmael is at best a sort of medieval foreshadowing. The writings of Bernard Lewis and others may praise pre-modern Muslim philosophy and social pluralism, but remain clear that their fullness, the final point of all history, had to wait for America. Here again, we might recall Augustine's presentation of Hagar as the figuring of Sarah, who alone is the figuring of the fulfillment, the free city. Such a triumphalist vision of Isaac and Sarah, archetypes of privilege, as the ultimate legitimators and source of Western power and wealth, are not going to commend themselves to Muslims. Perhaps the great dichotomy between Islam and the West, which is now in places expressing itself in violence, whether directed from caves in the Middle East or from the Pentagon, is nothing other than the working out of this divine comedy. If this is so, and I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that the scriptures, and not only my own, still give as well as receive, then Islam may need to think more clearly about the meaning of Ishmael and attempt a new theology of its current global humiliation, which is rooted in the prophet's dictum, "Poverty is my pride." The Ishmaelite quasi-egalitarian principle of sharing and solidarity is for Muslims a major component of theo-political action. Islam is often reproached for this, as were some liberation theologians under Pope John Paul II, but it is non-negotiable. Caesar has to be placed under restraint. For most of its history, Islam placed the relief of poverty and sickness in the hands not of a clerical class, but in the hands of the entire believing community, which was itself, as it were, priestly, and whose political leaders were accountable in Sharia law for the distribution to the poor of zakat and the various other religiously mandated tithes, oshr, kharaj, and so forth, on land and natural resources. The Waqf system, pious endowments, furnished the bulk of poor relief, together with orphanages, free education and healthcare for the physically and mentally ill. Under modern conditions, with Islamic cultures largely governed by elites who have converted to the values of the Western establishment, and whose populations have suffered grievously following the abolition of the Waqf system and publicly administered zakat tithes, the extraordinary growing gulf between rich and poor, which blights most Muslim countries, there is a pressing need to reinvigorate an Ishmaelite politics of the oppressed, and this need has been recognised and pursued by many Islamic leaders. But there's a difficulty here. the prophet's predictions concerning times of great sedition and distress, particularly the great wrath which precedes the end, insist on political disengagement, poverty and isolation. The prophet himself diagnosed the end times in terms of time passing more quickly, religious knowledge dying away, covetousness prevailing, and civil strife. Explaining the covetousness, the shuh, which humanity will descend into, one of the commentators, Qurtubi, says this will be acceptable, it will be studied, recommended, and invited to, as though greed for wealth becomes the dominant ideology of all humanity. The God-fearing commandment will be, as the prophet says, to snap your bows, break your bowstrings, and strike at stones with your swords. If any of you lives to see that time, let him be like the better of Adam's two sons. Renunciation too is counselled, as he says, the time has almost come when a Muslim's best wealth will be a few sheep with which he flees into the mountains. I spent some time speaking of the prophetic principle of holy poverty, surely a very countercultural and disturbing notion in our acquisitive and competitive age. But before I finish, I'd like to reflect on another aspect of prophetic teaching which seems also to have startled and challenged his people, and from which we can draw, I believe, quite a bit of benefit in our instrumentalizing times in which nature is presumed to be nothing more than a resource. And this is prophetic teaching on nature and the animal kingdom. It's notable that the Holy Prophet's teaching is very rich in references to the animal world. Let's consider a verse which appears in chapter 6, entitled Al-An'am, the cattle. This is verse 38. This is a cautious translation. There is not an animal in the earth, nor a bird flying on two wings, but that they are nations like yourselves. We have neglected nothing in the book, then unto their Lord they will be gathered. This is another of the verses which, by all accounts, the prophet staggered the Meccan elite. This idea of other peoples, other animal communities actually being peoples. They are nations like yourselves. And then unto their Lord they will be gathered, presumably for some form of judgment. Now, in their first context, passages such as these form part of the prophet's condemnation of Arab pagans, who in roughly Durkheimian vein had long defined their tribal identity in terms of animal totems. The founder himself had been born into the tribe of the shark. This is a very, very ancient, primordial, aboriginal kind of culture in which he's working. As part of its function of delineating tribal identities, paganism had maintained elaborate rituals of animal mutilation and other animal-linked practices which the new revelation saw as abominations. And this whole chapter receives its name because it deals with various such sacrificial and votive rites. In place of a universe directed by tribal deities in which humanity was divided by totems and fetishes, the new monotheism, preached by the prophet, seeks to inaugurate a fellowship of believers which was summoned to see the animal order as a sign of creation's unity and integrity under the one God. The Quran's initial targeting of indigenous Arab religion quickly took on wider implications as part of the continuum of late antique debates over the implications of monotheism for attitudes to the world. We already saw this in Levinas's characterization of the difference between Jewish and Christian understandings of the world, justice, redemption. The markedly upbeat, affective atmosphere of the Quranic revelation reflected the text's own self-understanding as a historic reparation, as it says, a shifa, a healing, not only of the ways of paganism, but of the religions of the book, Judaism and Christianity. When the new scripture of the Quran burst into the form of provinces of Christian Byzantium, it was widely received by its audience as a synthetic corrective, repairing the penitential and fiercely ascetical temper of early Christianity and pushing the dominant monotheistic style back in a generally Semitic direction. In a Mediterranean world where a pessimism about the world and the body had become normal among Christians who had inherited many of the world and body-denying assumptions of late Hellenistic religion, Islam saw itself as bringing unmistakably life-affirming, though hardly indulgent, worldview. Its anthropology repudiated patristic teachings on original sin and encouraged a pious style of travelling to God austerely, but genuinely, through the world, rather than reaching him by creeping around its edges. The new scripture's ceaseless conjurations with the material universe as a palette of signs pointing to God stood at the heart of Muslim styles of contemplation, in a new and more positive dispensation which was unmistakably biophiliac and even celebratory of the natural order. This seems to have been part of Carlyle's attraction to Islam. The Prophet was a world historical hero, a harbinger of Geist, an affirmer of life itself, all in a notably Hegelian and romantic vein. The Australian writer on religion, Rod Blackhurst, evinces this Quranic ethos in his essay on Muslim prayer. It's an interesting thing. I think you can find it online. For him, it turns out to be a primordial enactment of humanity's status as bridge between heaven and earth. The Muslim, emulating the Prophet, worships in a fully embodied way, in a mind-body syzygy, particularly characteristic of Islam's sense of itself as the reclamation of a putatively lost Abrahamic primordiality. The entire Muslim life is shaped by forms of worship which engage the body and spirit with the movements of sun and moon, and hence represent the believer's full belongingness to the created order. Nonetheless, he is, like Adam, between water and clay, the water which is of heaven and the clay which is the stuff of which he is made. This Abrahamic cosmology depicts religion as being of the fitra, the Quranic term which denotes nature and what is natural, not as fallen, but as a theophany shot through with grace and reminders of God's presence. It is perhaps due to this twofold prophetic challenge to Arabian and ancient Christian views of the natural world that we find the early Muslim scribes keen to record a very large bulk of prophetic directives on animal welfare. These have been investigated in a recent book by Richard Foltz, a text alert to the vast improvement, as he sees it, brought to formerly Christian and pagan territories by the arrival of the founder's new and reparative dispensation. Foltz even goes so far as to conclude that, as he says, the mainstream Islamic legal tradition accords more rights to non-human animals than do the legal systems of the contemporary West. A polemical statement, which he believes is supported by the witness of the classical Sharia canon and the pro-nature vision of the new prophetic post-Christian revelation. The founder, as a man exempling what Blackhurst identifies as Islam's distinct blend of a primordial sense of appurtenance to nature with an extremely uncompromising and simple monotheism, a kind of monotheismos, seems to have dispensed a good fraction of his moral teaching with reference to the animal kingdom. Some of his sayings are evidently attacks on pagan practices, as in the hadith where he says, "May God curse anyone who mutilates animals." But a larger genre indicates more general insistence on ethical treatment of the animal order. Just some examples. It is a great sin for a man to imprison the animals which are in his power. Another one. A dog was once panting by a well, almost dead with thirst. Beholding it, a harlot of the children of Israel removed her slipper, dipped it in the water, and gave it to drink. For this, God forgave her her sins. Another text. We were once on a journey with God's messenger who left us for a short while. We saw a humara bird with 2 young, and we took the young fledglings. The humara hovered with fluttering wings, and the Prophet returned, saying, "Who has injured this bird by taking its young? Return them to her." And again, the Prophet forbade that animals should be set to fight each other. In some cases, in this very extensive literature, we find the Prophet challenging the culture of hunting, which had existed in Arabia, really as an axiomatic practice, from time immemorial. While hunting game for food is still permitted, sport hunting is to be prohibited. So he says, "There is no one that without reason kills a sparrow or anything higher thereto, but that God shall ask him about it." And the Prophet cursed anyone who took an animate creature as a target. Now, all these texts have a straightforward hortatory purpose, emphasizing the essential value, goodness, worth of God's creation. But there's some more curious hadiths which seem to invest animals around the Prophet with a near-human degree of consciousness. And it's here that the puzzlement over our Quranic verse originates. What are we to make, for instance, of the following tale narrated in Abu Dawood's collection of hadiths? This hadith has the Prophet going into a farm where a camel is experiencing a fit of groaning with its eyes streaming. The Prophet, unafraid, walks over to it and rubs its ears, and it quietens down. He asks who the camel belongs to, and a man identifies himself as its owner. The Prophet says, "Do not fear God concerning this beast which he has let you own. It is complained to me that you starve it and tire it by overworking it and using it beyond its capacity. In the same hagiographies, we find that key instances in the Prophet's career depend on animals for their successful outcome, and that these animals are presented as recipients of some kind of divine inspiration. Perhaps the best-known example is the founder's choice of a site for his home and mosque when he arrived as a refugee in Medina. Seeing that rival clans wished to have the political advantage of having him as their guest to preclude disputes, he let go of the reins of his camel and said that Providence would guide it to the correct place. The site the camel eventually chose is now the location of his mosque and grave. In another incident, the Abyssinian Christian army which had come to destroy the Kaaba in Mecca is confounded by two animal interventions. Firstly, its fearsome battle elephant refuses to march on the holy city, and secondly, the invading army is miraculously pelted with stones by birds. A no less celebrated case is the rescue of the Prophet from pagan pursuers during his exodus to Medina. As he hides in a cave, pigeons make a nest and a spider weaves a web over the cave entrance, a miracle which served to persuade the search party that no one could have entered the cave for days. In these hadiths which show God's Prophet or his city saved by the intervention of animals, one is struck by the fact that these creatures are presented as consciously acting under divine tuition. This seems anomalous in a new religious culture in full revolt against a pagan animism in which desert creatures and even trees and rocks have been reckoned to contain genii of various kinds. A kind of Humean generalization about the rationalizing shift from polytheism to monotheism would presume that ancient superstitions about souls inhabiting the natural world would be vigorously suppressed in favor of a belief in divine and human monopoly of consciousness and agency. But in the primal Islamic case, something more complex seems to have emerged. Again, we seem to revert to Blackhurst's characterization of the founder's religion as a reprise of very ancient and even primordial styles of religion, coupled with the fierce rejection of any hint of polytheistic belief. Muslim tradition itself promotes this self-understanding. The Meccan shrine is claimed to have been the worshipping place of Adam, long predating the Jerusalem temple. Islam takes itself as being something genuinely ancient and primordial. It takes itself to be the final moment in the monotheistic drama, but also claims to be a significant rehabilitation and invocation of pre-Abrahamic forms of worship and relationship with the natural world. It's thus that the Prophet, who can communicate with the animals, bears a book which instructs its audience to consider them as nations like unto yourselves. Anyway, it is time for me to conclude. Any great world historical individual, and he includes others like Dante, Napoleon and others, world historical individuals who merit inclusion in Carlyle's gallery, manifests a panoply of moral and interior dimensions, any one of which could furnish the subject for a whole series of lectures. But I've offered a kind of brief report in which I've focused on two areas of what to me are of particular interest: the principle of holy poverty and the sanctity of the animal kingdom, that clearly did much to astonish his contemporaries and seem to evoke or to summon forth that unique atmosphere, that élan, which the founder of Islam dispersed among his contemporaries. Because the founding of a new religion is a good deal more than simply the expounding of a new set of moral rules and forms of worship. It comprises nothing less than the creation of a new human type, as Carlyle puts it, a truly new and world historical individual. That's it. Are we to have questions?
Thank you to Shaykh Abdal Hakim for giving us that talk. There's a lot to reflect on and take in, and so in that vein we're going to open the floor for questions. If we could limit it to one question per person, just in light of time, and so as many people can have their questions answered as possible. So yeah, if anybody has questions, just put your hand up.
You talked about the idea that the world is becoming more greedy and that greed is becoming the new ideology. does that mean that Muslims, as time goes on, are going to find themselves less able to take part in that society? If what you're saying is that this sort of rejection of that group is inherently Islamic?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I suspect it's not specifically a question just for Muslims. It's probably a question for a lot of world-renouncing Buddhists and traditional Christians and others who are not convinced by the simple promises that through material consumption and the acquisition of status symbols we will achieve felicity. I think there's a general unease in the world religions, and that's probably one of the most useful prophetic voices that the world religions can adopt nowadays, that they are proposing not a kind of fine-tuning of the economic juggernaut wherever it's heading. Nobody really seems to have a clue, but a fundamental reservation of heart about the value of a competitive turbo-capitalism, a beggar thy neighbour greed, which seems to be producing just along the way to this unimaginable destination such extraordinary disparities of income, interest-related debt, forms of iniquitous international trade, and so many of the forms of misery and injustice in today's world of economic nature. So, yes, I think Muslims have to have this reservation of heart about the international economic system as it exists now. It's not just Lord Green and HSBC, and that's just the tip of an iceberg, which is something that I think people of conscience, and no doubt many secular people, also regard as profoundly troubling. What's characteristically Islamic is that the religion, because of its doubts about the policy of a wholesale renunciation of the world, renunciation of a whole lot of pleasures, but not renunciation of the world. The Prophet was not in a cave forever. He came out of his cave and joined the world and was at the centre of the economic and political life, social life of his community. That, as the poem I cited indicates, one moves to the next world through this world rather than trying to get around it. And that's quite a sort of Levinasian and Judaic conception as well, which is what he's getting at. That we can't make the world perfect and we can't be perfect, but we have to strive for justice and do as much as we can rather than stay in a monastery and pray for the second coming, which is his possibly stereotypical idea of the Christian idea. So, yeah, Islam does have this specific technique, and it's only Muslims who have created a significant, although certainly ramshackle and problematic, alternative to the global banking system with Islamic banks, which do have certain sort of ethical virtues to them. It's not just a sham. The zakat tithe, which naturally disaggregates fortunes, because you're not just paying your tax on your income, but on your wealth. So you lose a 40th of it every year, which makes it difficult really to accumulate vast fortunes. It's hard to escape, and it's a Quranic religious obligation. Similarly, the inheritance laws, characteristically in Islam, there's no conception that you can will all of your wealth to your eldest son or to Battersea Dogs Home or to Downing College or some other unworthy recipient. But you can actually, you have to have it dispersed according to set percentages to your surviving relatives, which also disaggregates family fortunes over the years quite successfully. So those are examples of a way in which the Islamic anxiety about the global financial system actually already has certain strategies which are not controversial amongst Muslims, and in many places do actually have an effect.
Any more questions?
How much do you think his wife, who I believe was a very strong, important woman in his life, influenced his philosophy on the things you've been talking about this evening?
I guess you're talking about his first wife, Khadija.
Khadija.
Yeah, he was married to her for 20 years. Well, from a theologian's point of view, his philosophy is not really his philosophy, it's God's inspiration. It's the teachings of the Quran, which comes from heaven and isn't just a consequence of earthly forces and individuals who were influencing him in his environment. We certainly know that she was a strong... I gave another lecture a couple of years ago in Oxford about the Prophet's wives, and as a way of understanding his conception of womanhood, gender relations, which is another enormously important subject which I didn't have time for today, but is really interesting, about how she represents a particular type of quite autonomous, independent womanhood. She continued to trade. She was his employer. It's interesting to think of a founder of a world religion, which we normally think of as very patriarchal, actually being employed by his wife, financially dependent on his wife. But that was the reality, and he never sought to change that. So, yeah, an inspiration for him, but not a source of his teachings, I think.
Any more questions?
Is that middle of the term feeling?
Oh, yeah, at the front.
Yep.
Your talk, which was excellent, entitled "Who is Muhammad?"
Mm-hmm.
May peace be upon him. He was the last prophet. Another prophet was Isa, or Jesus. My question is, it's reported that Jesus did miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any evidence that Muhammad, may peace be upon him, did miracles as well?
Mm-hmm. If you set aside modern historiographical nervousness about the actuality of miracles and look at the Muslim memory itself, yeah, the Muslim histories and biographies are replete with with miracles that the Prophet himself is said to have worked. And some of them are quite similar to those reported of Jesus, of feeding large numbers of people, and miracles relating to healing. One occasion where he brings back somebody from the dead, or seems to. This set of incidents that I reported where he seems to be able to communicate with animals, which comes up again and again, and the birds that drop stones on the Ethiopian army, and the elephant that won't advance on God's sanctuary in Mecca. These clearly miraculous, supernatural events. But the hagiographers will also say that the greatest miracle is prophecy and the reception of revelation itself, and a doctrine developed of the Quran as an apologetic miracle, that is to say, just in the power and the beauty of its Arabic diction, it represents something that clearly is not a human artifact. But having said that, I guess it might be a fair generalization that the sense of the Prophet as a miracle worker is probably slightly less developed than, say, a traditional Christian reading the New Testament, whatever one might want to make of that.
Assalamu alaikum. You've spoken about poverty and striking the balance between physical life and making through this world to the spiritual world. What is your advice to the younger community, if you like, in terms of you do studies, you're looking forward to achieving a mortgage or whatever it is, a ground mortgage, whatever it is, the conundrum will be at some point. What is your advice to striking that balance in this contemporary society in UK?
Well, the modern system is very good at encouraging asceticism, I must say, amongst the young, because it gets you into debt very early, and if you don't pay it back early, it's forgiven on your 50th birthday or something unimaginable. And we have a situation in which the default for young people is not only to be poor, but actually to be in debt, which is a terrible kind of default. It's always happened de facto, but for the system being predicated on that is a horrible thing. In America, it's become much worse. Even if you work, somehow it just gets worse. And if you look at the rate of the student loans, it creeps up every year. When it was brought in, it was almost free, and now it's gone up 6% or something. So my son, who's at Brighton University, tells me that there's a 60-year-old in his class who's only studying because the student loan is much cheaper than the mortgage rate. So he can get money to pay his mortgage by being a student. Yeah, well, it's going to go up, and it's an iniquitous system. And that people of my generation and older often have more liquidity than they know what to do with. There's a lot of smart cars in Cambridge and some fancy suburbs. And a lot of students are really struggling. And people on minimum wage or being paid less than the living wage, there's a very large number of them, even in the Cambridge bubble, the Cambridge phenomenon, let alone Pontefract or Walsall or Weston-super-Mare, where things are really quite grim, and every high street is charity shops, sue riders, Poundland. It's tough, but still we're told there's an economic miracle taking place, but it's not for everybody. And the young particularly suffer because they don't have much clout. They have a vote, quite often they don't use it, But it's only really when you get to be a captain of industry or an MP that your voice is actually heard in the society. So where the government is tightening people's belts, it tends to be the young people that are suffering the most. So yeah, asceticism is an easy option in modern Britain. Yeah. But the idea of renunciation as a virtue is not completely dead. And if you look at the likes of Bill Gates and some others, the amount of charitable giving they give is actually pretty immense. There are some very generous people. Templeton Foundation, for instance, capitalised at $2 billion or something, huge sums. So often where governments recede from their responsibilities, the rich can step up to the crease, and sometimes that does happen, but still. London is obviously packed with oligarchs from around the world who are living in super rich mansions. It's become probably unsustainable. It's difficult under very secular conditions to inculcate generosity. Last year the Charities Commission produced figures which looked at what sort of people give most to charity. And actually they found that the Muslim community gives more in charity per capita than any other community, even though it's one of the poorest communities. And they found consistently that atheists give much less than committed members of religions, and that's probably understandable and probably a global phenomenon. Yeah. Anybody else?
How does this principle of poverty work itself out in Muslim majority countries? For example, you do hear cases of people refugees being refused medical treatment.
Yep.
Unless they become Muslim and therefore become eligible to receive the zakat. Similarly, Christians or other people from other religions in some countries are at a severe disadvantage socially. They can't get the same kind of jobs and so on. How does that all fit in?
Well, I've been speaking about the prophetic example, not about the behaviour of modern day regimes, which Muslims will be the first to tell you have nothing to do with Islam. You go to Dubai, what is there about prophetic poverty, for instance? I mean, it's nice, you can go skiing and then you can go shopping and it's kind of cool, but it's nothing to do with any religion's idea of sort of balanced austerity. The Muslim world is going through a process of rapid modernization that brings to the surface some of the worst principles. The world's biggest, anybody know where is the world's most profitable branch of Burger King? Of course, it's in the city of Mecca. World's biggest Hilton hotel, the symbols of conspicuous consumption and ugly capitalism are there in the holy city itself. So, the Muslim world is very far from the ideals that I've been preaching. Just as, for instance, there's mega churches in America which have the Dunkin' Donuts in the lobby, so you can sort of stuff yourself and drink a bucket of coffee while the preacher is doing his thing. It's got nothing to do with the apostolic poverty of Christ and his apostles. It's just how things are. Religionists being their own worst enemies as usual. Who's next?
Can you explain more on how the prophets advocated women's rights?
Well, that would be to open a different topic, which is some way from what I've been discussing. You can see, I think, the Oxford ISOC put my lectures on the Prophet's womenfolk on YouTube, so you can look at that if you like. And some very colourful comments as well, if you can bear to look at them. But the important point to remember is that one is wasting one's time if one wishes to see in any past ages exemplary human beings a kind of miraculous anticipation of what we in the early 21st century happen to regard as what is obviously right. It's not like that. In fact, prophecy is often about disrupting contemporary expectations. You can identify ideas of equality, but they may not have much to do with, say, Germaine Greer's ideas of equality. And a certain Muslim apologetic that likes to see Islam as the miraculous anticipation of the wonders of the modern world is, I think, not realistic. Not realistic. And that's the case for people who are reading the Bible and find all kinds of interesting modern values and relationships in the Bible, I suspect it's not really an honest interpretation of the intentions of the culture of those texts. But yeah, it is on YouTube, so you can watch it if you're interested.
Anybody else have a question? Okay, nobody else wants to ask.
If there's no one else asking a question. You've covered when you talk a lot is about the Prophet Sallallahu and his connection to the animal world, and also the hadith about the Prophet Sallallahu when he said, "Will come a time when people will run to protect the religion, they'll run to the mountains with the sheep."
Yeah.
How much, again in the contemporary setting, how much would you encourage people to connect with nature by perhaps going to the green living, raising your own chicken, eggs, having sheep, fish in the back garden?
Yeah, I mean, we can't all do that. Muslims are a quarter of the world's population, and there aren't enough sheep to go around, I should think. Mountains around Cambridge are in short supply. Obviously, this is the enunciation in poetic language of a general principle that in times of tumult, the Prophet says if there's a kind of civil war or tumult, what you don't do is get involved. He says you hit stones with your sword and break your bow. And that's the way of the wise whenever they see some sort of fitna or tumult. Whereas the idiot wants to pose on the back of a tank because he's just shot somebody who he disagrees with. That's a kind of demonic possibility that some people fall into. That's from the ego. Whereas the prophetic instruction is, don't get involved. Be a pacifist. The end time instruction is to be a pacifist. The animal thing I do find challenging. That's why I wanted to raise it this evening, although it's not something that figures generally, even in most Muslim traditional presentations of prophetic teaching. But it's very conspicuous in the Quran, the conjurings of the beauties of the natural world, and in the Hadith. All of these stories about the Prophet do come from somewhere. This is obviously part of his moral agenda for his society, that he didn't like seeing people ritually mutilating animals in front of idols, but defended them. And it's palpably the case. All of these stories, story after story after story, where he stands up for the rights of animals. And as Fox indicates, his book on animals in Islam is really a good book, even though he's a kind of hardline militant vegetarian that has issues with things like ritual slaughter. But his understanding of Islam's respect for the animal kingdom and the idea that animals really do have a kind of consciousness, they're sentient beings, which you have to affirm, otherwise it doesn't make sense for the Prophet to be talking to camels and setting birds free and so forth. There's a very interesting and challenging aspect of the prophetic biography.
I mean, I've tried to, for the past year, try raising a chicken, which is, I'll tell you...
Which college are you at?
Well, me and my wife here were on our 5th batch of chicks.
Yeah. Good. No,
constantly keep asking yourself, what would the Prophet have done when this chicken is flying away or doesn't want to go in? But it's a simple question, but this is the question I ask: what would my leader have done in this simple situation? Getting up for Fajr, cockerel making noise. This is why I asked this question for personal benefit. Is how much should I push in that direction?
Yeah, there is, I think, and it's not just a sentimental experience. People find when they engage with nature some sort of settling or de-stressing or healing within their souls. I don't quite know where that comes from. Perhaps some ancestral memory of the 99% of the history of our species when we were with animals all the time. And all of this is something very unnatural to us, and we need to get back to that. But I certainly think there is a healing in animals, and it doesn't just mean having a cute rabbit at home or a naughty dog. It means, kind of, I think, engagement with horses in particular. The company of horses I find to be very healing in some, no doubt, superstitious way. And actually in Turkey, I know a group which maintains in Istanbul the principle of healing mental illnesses through horse riding, which is a very ancient Turkish craft. And they believe that if you diagnose somebody who has a particular mental disorder and put them on the back of a horse whose hooves go in a particular rhythm, is actually beneficial. They still do that. And yeah, I kind of believe that. It's certainly something we need to reconnect with, because one of the big questions of our modernity is not just about whether the crazy economic system is headed for catastrophe, but it's also whether the whole system ultimately is going to overload the human metabolism beyond its natural limits, and we'll see some more general breakdown and rates of sort of depression, failures of relationship, all kinds of stresses and strains are happening to not just the student body, but to humanity generally in the West. This is the Prozac nation phenomenon. We're not designed to negotiate spaghetti junction or to do the complex things on the internet that we do. We're designed for something much more natural, organic, simple, which isn't to mean that that's how we have to be. But the question is, how far can we go from what we've been designed to do before we really start to break down psychologically, metabolically? I don't think anybody knows. I don't think anybody has a clue.
Just take 2 questions in like the time.
It's probably a big question to ask with 3 minutes to go, but what would you say is unique or extraordinary about Muhammad, peace be upon him, compared to the prophets, like the major prophets of the world religions?
Well, the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi speaks of bezels or clasps of wisdom. So he says that the jewel, which is the light of monotheism and the divine presence, divine truth, is always the same and emits the same light. But the clasp, it's like a ring which has a little clasp which holds the diamond. That's different in each case. So each of the prophets has a particular temperament, a particular genius, a particular human metabolism that's distinctive. And what sums up the Mohammedan form of clasping the divine light is a very subtle question. I've tried to point towards it by looking at this question of holy poverty and this question of his relationship to the natural world and the animal kingdom. But there's so much more that is in there. I think if you read a good biography of the Prophet, like Martin Lings's book, Muhammad, His Life, based on the earliest sources, which is useful in that he doesn't intrude his own commentary or interpretation at all. He just tells the story, so you can form your own conclusions. That we would say that there is a passionate love of God, a love of the world insofar as it is of God, an affirmation of the natural functions of humanity, a love of marriage and children, the possibility of sacred warriorhood, the stern requirement to overcome suffering and to stand up for the marginalized, and a constant awareness of death and the reality of eternity. Those are some of the boxes that I'd like to tick if I was looking at specifically Mohammedan type of prophecy. All of those things you can find, say, in Christian, Jewish, other forms of devotion, but the weighting, I think, is slightly different. But yeah, it's the key question, but it's not easy to put into words. Paul Sutherland, who comes to Cambridge sometimes, is a Canadian poet. He has a new book, in fact it's the most recent collection of books, which is about the Prophet of Islam. And I think he captures something quite authentic in those poems, if you look at those. It's more a poet's question than an academic's. One more?
One more?
To go off with on the animal kingdom, we're consuming a lot of meat and there's a lot of processed product.
Yep.
What's your opinion about comparing that to the life of the Prophet?
Well, there's a number of issues. Obviously, you can't read these hadiths that say, for instance, if one of you prays and fasts and yet maltreats one of his chickens, God will not resurrect him amongst the just, and not be freaked out about sort of the industrial rearing of battery chickens, for instance. So do you go to Chicken Rush on Hills Road? I find that difficult sometimes. It's convenient, it's cheap, but there are issues there, because this is prophetic teaching, and these institutions and this industrialization of animal flesh is something that clearly is an aberration. The human-animal relationship is based on the concept of the sacred, and the idea of ritual